Hey everyone, welcome back. Today I've been in the kitchen for several hours working on a couple meals for a sweet lady at our church who just had surgery. And usually we set up a meal train and everyone that can signs up to bring her a meal. So I had to put together a few meals that work for their dietary needs, and I just wanted to share that with you. So check that video out now. Okay, so for this meal plan, there were a couple of dietary needs that I needed to pay attention to. One of them was low sodium. The other was it needed to be soft, which isn't really necessarily like a dietary allergy, but the recipient of this had had another previous procedure done, which requires soft food currently. And the other was no tomato-based products. And so I decided to go with meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and peas. And then I gave them some rolls, all of which were soft. And then, of course, I did watch the sodium content, because you can always add in more salt, but you cannot take salt back out of something. And so I wanted to find something just a touch different than what most people were doing. Most people were signing up for soups because, again, the request was soft foods, but I wanted a little bit heartier meal, something more home cooked that would just be different than the typical soup, which is what a lot of people would reach for, which is completely and totally understandable because it needed to be soft. So I'm going to go ahead and get my potatoes ready and get them on the stove, because they will take a little while for the water to come to a boil, for them to get soft, and then that way I can work on assembling the rest of the food for their meal. Now, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll pick one of the meals and that's what I'll bring them the night of, and then I will sign up for a second meal, which is what I'm doing, that they can put in the freezer and pull out and pop in the oven or crock pot, depending on what I'm making, to keep it really simple. We were going to be heading out of town and there were still a couple of slots available, and I don't like that when there's a meal train. I like to come in and fill in the gaps if possible, because it's the least I can do, because I've been there before when we've needed help and have had people step in. And of course now, because of our dietary needs, it's actually very, very difficult for people to cook for us. So I wanted to make sure I went and gave them an extra meal that they could use later. So what I am working on now is the meatloaf. And with my meatloaf, I do not add any crumbs to them. No Italian crumbs, no panko bread crumbs, no bread at all. Because our daughter has celiacs, I've learned to make meatloaf without any breading. And I've actually found that if you increase the eggs that you add to your meatloaf, that acts as a binder that will hold the meatloaf together without the need of having any breadcrumbs, which you honestly cannot even tell the difference that it's in there. So what I have is 2 pounds of ground beef. I put in 3 eggs, and then I believe it was a half a cup of milk. Now, milk will actually soften the ground beef to make the meatloaf more tender. It sounds weird, but it's a trick I learned years ago. So I'm just doing a pinch of salt and a pinch of pepper, probably no more than a half a teaspoon of each, which is not much for 2 pounds. But again, I was trying to be very careful with their dietary needs and not put in too much salt, and I made sure that they were aware of that. So I'm also adding in some garlic, which was about a teaspoon, and then about a teaspoon of dried onion flakes. Decided to go ahead and do that because I was concerned if I used fresh onion that they may not soften enough for what the wife needed. And so this is a great way to get in some onion flavor. I mean, you can use granulated onion, of course, but I decided to go with the onion flakes to add that in there. And so I just gave it a quick whisk, as you can see. And then I'm just going to go ahead and add in my ground beef. Now, again, it's 2 pounds. I wanted to make sure I was feeding 3 adults, that they had enough for leftovers for the next day or two, depending on how much they eat. So I always like to give sometimes a bit more than probably what would normally feed somebody. But again, typically meal trains are every other day. So I want to make sure people have leftovers, and then the next night can be really easy for them as well. So with the meatloaf, I'm just going to go ahead and get it all mixed up. You can choose to put on gloves. You can use a spoon. I just find getting my hands in there, and I was actually out of gloves, but they are clean. And so there's not any issue with just getting your hands in there and working the meat until everything is mixed through. And then I'm just going to go ahead and get it into the pan after that. Okay, so the meatloaf is now mixed together. I like to use the foil pans because it makes it really easy for people to just throw it away. They don't have to worry about returning or replacing anything. It just keeps it super simple. I was out of loaf pans, and so I just used what I had. I just used a little, I think, 8x8 square cake pan, and that worked perfectly fine. And so typically I will top my meatloaf with a sauce. I usually like to mix ketchup and brown sugar together and put that on top. But because one of the restrictions was nothing tomato based, I opted not to do that. So there would be no topping on here, but typically if I was just making it for my family, there would be, which just adds an extra level of flavor to it. And so it's super simple. I'm just going to wrap it up and stick it in the fridge until it's time to work, put it in the oven for dinner. And then I'm going to move on to the breakfast casserole. As I was trying to decide what the second meal would be, I decided to go with breakfast for dinner, and I found a recipe online for an egg casserole that doesn't require it to be baked ahead of time, which I kind of liked because I was concerned about baking it, putting it in the freezer, and then heating it through what the consistency would be like. So I decided to go with this recipe, and I will make sure to link it in the description box below. I actually made it for our family that night too. Usually when I do meals like this, I will pick either just the one meal, or if I'm doing multiple meals, I'll pick one of those to make extra so we can have it for dinner. Because typically once I've been in the kitchen all day, by the time I've delivered the meal and got back home, I'm tired and I don't really want to cook, quite honestly. And so usually I will double or triple up on something so then we can have the exact same thing for dinner, and it works out really, really well. So with this casserole, it's going to be a dozen eggs, and then you can honestly add whatever you want to it. I opted to change the recipe to a degree from what the original one was. She wanted spinach, and I think she had tomatoes in it. Again, no tomato based products. And so I decided to just go with ham and cheese. Now, the ham may or may not it may not be soft enough for the recipient of the meal, but I know that it would be really easy to work around it and not eat the ham if needed. But I wanted to make sure that there was something else in there because there were 2 other adults that were going to be eating this. And so I'm also going to put cheese in it as well. And I made this for my family. You will actually see it here in a moment, that I went ahead and put this together for our dinner that night because I really wanted to try it. I mean, it's basically a crustless quiche is what I'm making. And so it was really, really good. It baked up really well. We really enjoyed it, and I actually had some the next morning for breakfast, and it reheated in the microwave extremely well. So this is one of those things that I will be adding in to our recipe box to do these again in the future for either meals for people that need it or just for us to have for dinner. Okay, so I have one of the ham steaks chopped up for their casserole, and the other one is chopped up for our dinner. I did add in 2 cups of shredded cheddar cheese. Again, you can add in whatever you like. I felt like the ham and cheese would be the easiest to remain soft for the people that were receiving the meal. But again, if you're just making it for yourself, add in whatever you want. This is basically just a crustless quiche is what it is. And so, but what's great about it is it really will just pop in the freezer in a raw state, and then you can just pop it in the oven and bake it when you're ready. You do want to pull it out the night before and thaw it in the refrigerator, but then just pop it in the oven and it will bake for 45 minutes. But it makes a great breakfast option. It also makes a great brunch or even dinner. Like I said, if you're going to do breakfast for dinner, this is a great thing that would fill up your family. Now, I did add more to their breakfast for dinner. I added in pancakes along with syrup, and then I also added in orange juice as well, so they could truly have a breakfast for dinner. But again, match it to whatever you want or whatever the person's needs are that you're bringing this meal to. So I'm going to go ahead and get this wrapped up so I can get it in the freezer, and then we can move on to setting up our egg casseroles for our dinner. Now, one thing I like to do when I'm bringing someone a meal, whether they are going to eat it that night or they are going to pull it out later, is to write on the foil what it is, along with any directions that they need, just in case if I printed out the recipe, they would lose it. I also do this on anything that would go into a gallon size bag as well. I've done it before for cookies or whatever it would possibly be, just to make it easier so they have it right there in front of them. And so now I'm just going to go ahead and get the eggs ready for our meal as well. Like I said, a lot of times I will pick one of them and double up on it. And I decided to go ahead and try this because I had already chopped up all the ham. I had extra cheese. And so I wanted to go ahead and put this together. Plus, I just really wanted to try it. We love having breakfast for dinner. So I'm going to get the eggs cracked. And then, as you can see, I have some little pans at the bottom of the screen. You will see those in a moment. Each person got their own individual casserole. And so it worked out well because we have one that doesn't eat dairy. And so I'm cracking her eggs in a separate bowl because I'm going to mix everything up. Because I'm going to be adding in milk to the larger bowl. I'm going to be adding in her dairy-free cream to hers, so she still gets that creamy texture with obviously not having any dairy intake. So I'm going to go ahead and get those set up, and then at the end of this video you will see how it all comes together, and it was really, really good. Now, as I put these together, that dairy-free cream, if you have someone that has a dairy allergy and you can find that, I can usually find it at our local Publix here, and I believe in the Atlanta area when we go back to visit, I can always find it at a Kroger. It is wonderful. Honestly, for being dairy-free or plant-based, you cannot tell that it is. And I'm not even kidding. I am not fond of things that are, dairy-free. I don't like almond milk. Coconut milk is fine, but obviously will taste like coconut. And so to have found this product really changed the game for us with what I could make our daughter. I use it in place of a lot of things that need some sort of fat or creamy texture, and it has worked great in a variety of different recipes. Now, I just added a touch more eggs to this, but it was all done. So now that I've worked on all that, now the potatoes have been drained and ready, as you can see. Now, I did pull some out because I made some for our daughters to have. They love mashed potatoes, and so this was more than enough potatoes for the recipient of this meal. It was actually way more than they would need. This was just because I had potatoes in the house and I needed to use all of them up, so I cooked all of them and then pulled some out. And now I like to add typically milk or heavy cream to my mashed potatoes. This time I just added milk, and I'm also adding in salt. Again, very light on the salt because you are going to have some salt content with the butter. I don't use unsalted butter. And then I like to always add granulated garlic to my mashed potatoes, make them a little bit more garlicky. You can, obviously, a lot of people make mashed potatoes, don't really need a lot of assistance on how to make them. Add in whatever flavors you like. Sometimes I'll take the easy route and I'll scrub my potatoes but not peel them and leave the peels in the mashed potatoes. But again, because this texture needed to be soft, I opted to make sure that I peeled all of my potatoes as well. So I'm going to get these mixed up, and then that part of the meal is done. And what I will be doing with this as well is when they go into the foil pan, they're going to cool, and then I'm going to be popping them in the oven the night that I'll be taking this meal to them. And it is basically making like a twice baked potato almost. And my mom used to do this when we were growing up, and they were so good. It makes them even creamier. And then as they bake, they kind of form this crust on top of the potatoes, and that's like the best part of the potato. It was so good. So if I have time when I'm making mashed potatoes, and I like to pop them in the oven and cook them for a bit longer. And usually I cook them at 375 for about 35 minutes to heat them all the way through. Now, if they are hot from the stove and I've mashed them and I'm just popping them in the oven, then I would say maybe about 20 to 25 minutes. You're just looking for them to brown on the top, and you'll see that just a little bit later in the video. Now, I did make sure I tasted the potatoes to make sure that there wasn't too much salt, but yet you could taste the pepper and the garlic. Ever since I had my ear surgery last year, my taste buds have been a little bit messed up. They're still healing from the surgery. I won't go into the explanation on why, but I do need to taste things, and I need to be careful. So something with low sodium is going to taste probably even more plain to me than the average person, because for some reason that surgery, when it damaged the taste buds, salt is one of those things that I can have trouble with and tasting. So I tried to be very, very careful, but I wanted to make sure at least the garlic and the pepper came through the potatoes, and they did. Okay, so the potatoes are now done, and I'm going to go ahead and get them in their foil container. I did go ahead and spray it because I'm doing twice baked potatoes. I don't want them to stick once they've been reheated in the oven, and so it's up to you depending on how you're going to do your potatoes. I would recommend trying the twice baked potato method. It is really, really good, and it does actually make them even creamier by doing so. So once this is done, they're going to get covered in foil, but I'm going to leave a gap so the steam can escape as they completely cool down, and then that way you're not sticking something very hot into the fridge. You want to let it cool down. Again, this was done in the morning, so I still had plenty of time before it needed to go in the oven. And now I've decided to go ahead and make them some beef gravy. Usually I will use my beef stock that I have in the freezer or canned in the pantry, but for this I didn't have any additional plans for beef stock. And I didn't want to open it up and then waste it. We were heading out of town, and so I wasn't going to be home to cook meals for about 5 days, and so it didn't make sense. So this better than bouillon paste works really well for making a really quick gravy. It infuses a lot of flavor into the water. You do want to bring it to a boil and then add in. It is only supposed to be 2 tablespoons per cup, and this is 2 cups of water. I did heaping tablespoons, and I probably should have just stuck with the 1 tablespoon, so let me just put that out there. Only do the 1. This wound up being a touch too salty. Initially when I tasted it, it seemed fine, and so but I opted to try it one more time before putting it in their container, and it did wind up being a little too salty. So basically all I did was take the gravy that I made. See, I should have never added in more. Take the gravy that I made and then poured some in a bowl, and then added some additional water to it to thin out the saltiness in it, because I didn't want to overwhelm them with it. And again, this is just because of my taste buds are a little off sometimes when it comes to salt. It's kind of tricky sometimes. So I'm learning to work around it, and as everything is still healing, it's getting better, but I always have to sometimes have my husband come in behind me and go, just taste this to make sure that I didn't put too much salt in there. But I did, but that's okay. I fixed it, and then it was very mild, and it wasn't really salty by the time I added in the additional water and then split it between the two. Now, one thing I like to add towards the end of my gravy is some butter. That helps kind of smooth it out and gives it a creamy flavor to it. It's not necessary, just something that I like to do. Okay, so here's the gravy after I split it between the two. It was just too much. And so what's in the pot is what I thinned out and then re-thickened, and it was so much better. So I have these disposable containers that I like to use. I will use them to hold sauces, to hold broth or whatever. It's obviously too hot, so I'm just going to go ahead and then store it aside, let it cool down to room temperature. And I did warm up their gravy before I left the house. Now that I just is for us, and I went ahead and let that cool, and I put that in the freezer for later use. I just will have to remind myself that because I did put butter in it, so I will have to make a small batch for our other daughter who cannot have dairy. But again, adding in the butter, is just a nice little touch to round it out, smooth it out, and then just give it a little bit of creaminess without adding in milk. You could do milk, but I don't like to do that, so I use the butter instead. I labeled it as well, and now I'm moving on to, I think we had about an hour and a half before it was time to drop off their dinner. So I'm just unwrapping the potatoes. That is when they are finished, and that is the meatloaf. Now keep in mind, again, there was no sauce that went on top because of their tomato base restrictions that they had, and so I couldn't do barbecue sauce and I couldn't do ketchup. But if I was making it for us, I would absolutely put a sauce on top and have baked it in that. And now, because I'm taking this to them tonight, I still wanted everything to be really hot so they could eat it right away once it was dropped off, and that we don't have to worry about reheating. So I like to wrap it really well in foil, and then that way everything arrives warm for them to enjoy right away. So when it came to the peas, I went ahead and softened some butter, and then I heated up the peas in the microwave, and I'm just pouring them on top. I will add a little bit of salt and some pepper to them again, and then just wrap them in foil. And so as you could see, their dinner was meatloaf, mashed potatoes, brown gravy, peas, Hawaiian rolls, and then their dessert, which you'll see in just a little bit. I always throw in a dessert with every meal just because, well, one, they actually requested dessert, so they really wanted some desserts, and so we made sure we included one with each one, including the breakfast for dinner. But again, I always love to throw in a dessert because sometimes when you're not feeling well, it's that comfort food that helps make you feel just a little bit better. And so that's why I always like to add in a dessert. Again, personal preference, but I am a dessert kind of girl, so that's what I like to do. Now, depending on what I've made for somebody when I'm dropping it off, I do like to use this insulated holder. I don't even know. I know it's got a name, but I can't think of it right now. It's made by Pyrex, and it comes with the gel insert that you can either freeze or heat up. I only use it to heat things up, as I'm just trying to play around with seeing what will fit and what won't fit in here to try to keep it warm. I used to have a couple of them, but then when we moved, I gave them away, so I've only purchased one. A lot of times I'll bring other things that I don't need this for, so it really truly just varies based on how far I have to travel and exactly what I'm making and bringing. And as you can see, I did make it work, and it kept everything nice and hot. They were only about 10 minutes away from our house, and so everything was able to arrive warm, and they were able to enjoy it right away. And so I just want to thank you guys for hanging out with me today as I just share with you a couple of meals that I made. Again, working around people's dietary needs is something that I can easily do because I am so used to it. But just to kind of think outside the box for some people can be a little tricky. But you know what? Just hop on the internet and you can find all kinds of recipes, or come to YouTube and we can show you how to do things. This was the breakfast real quick. You can see the casserole, the pancakes, the syrup, the orange juice, and the dessert I got. I'm sorry about the lighting. It was getting kind of dark. And then at the end here is my breakfast casserole. So thank you guys so much. Like, subscribe, and share this channel. Thank you, and see you guys in the next one.